Hello, my name is Dominick Gorsline, and I am going to be talking about passwords as part of my CIS 4850 service learning project. I'm going to talk about passwords in general. I'm going to talk about bad passwords, good passwords, two-factor and multi-factor authentication, password management systems, and how all of these tools can be used together in order to improve security. So passwords are significant because they help secure critical information. Most websites will have some of your personal information stored in some form, whether it's your name, your birthday, or even your email address. But there are other websites that will have credit card information stored for when you're purchasing something or paying a bill. And password security is very important on those sites. But having good passwords isn't really enough. You also need to develop good password habits, which will lead to increased security. And accept that passwords are just a necessary part of modern life. They're used on pretty much every website where an account is necessary, and they're even used in some other places. So, in the most basic sense, a password is a combination of letters, numbers, and symbols, although it can just be numbers, like in the case of a PIN. And it is used to both protect accounts and verify the identity of the user. So, bad passwords. Bad passwords are typically created out of habit, and they're very dangerous because they compromise account security, usually for the sake of convenience. There's this belief a lot of times that your account will probably not be targeted by an attacker, which sometimes leads to users being lax on security. But bad passwords can actually create more problems in the long run than to sit down and try to figure out a good password for your accounts. So there are some common practices associated with bad passwords. The first and one of the most common ones that should be absolutely avoided is using a birth date as a password. These are very easy to guess and oftentimes will be guessed very quickly by an attacker. Sequences should also be avoided, particularly in the case of mobile phone passwords, which is just like using 1234 for your PIN, or ABCD or QWERTY. Those are also very commonly found in password cracking lists, and it takes absolutely no time at all for an attacker to get into an account using those passwords. In the same sense, short passwords are also a very bad idea, just because it decreases the amount of time that an attacker will need to get into your account. However, the opposite is also true, where you should not use incredibly long passwords just because that's not really a good password habit. That's just unnecessarily complicating things on your end. And lastly, dictionary words, like just very common words, should not be used as passwords for the same reason as some of the other bad practices. It's just very easy to guess those. Other bad practices include reusing passwords, which is probably by far one of the most common bad habits that is out there. Reusing passwords is a very big problem because if an attacker gets one of your passwords, it would be very easy for them to apply the same password to other accounts. A lot of times this is seen when someone uses a password for like a non-critical account, like a video game or something, but that user is using the same password for like their banking information, which would, under normal circumstances, be a lot more difficult of an account to get into. But it doesn't matter because they use the same password. Not regularly changing an account password is also a big issue. If an attacker ends up getting password lists, it does take some time to crack into an account. So usually changing your password regularly is done so that in case an attacker does have your password, by the time they decrypt it, it wouldn't matter because the password has been changed at that point. Writing passwords down is usually a bad practice just because, from the physical security point of things, it's very easy for other people to come around and just see what your password is. This is usually a bigger issue in the workplace than at home, but if you happen to be the victim of a burglary, this could be a problem. And lastly is just sharing passwords. A lot of times this will be done with someone who you think you can trust, but you do have to be careful because once your password's out there, it is out there until the next time you change it. So, yeah. So what is a good password? Good passwords are passwords that are difficult for attackers to guess, and they are formed out of good habits. Good passwords are necessary because much of the information stored online in your account is critical information, which at the very least would be private towards you and is not something that you would regularly share with people. So, for both personal privacy and security information, it's good to have good passwords. As I said, good password making is more of a habit than just a one-time thing. It's important to have good passwords across all of your accounts, and the benefit is that in the long run you won't have to worry about breaches or losing access to personal information as much as someone who does have bad password making habits would. Although, of course, many things are still important, like updating and whatnot. Some good password habits are creating passwords that are complex yet memorable. Having complex passwords is a good step to protect your account, but it doesn't really help if you're constantly using the forgot my password button on websites, just because you'll be redoing passwords over and over again, and a lot of times this can end up in a bad password habit where you just give up on making good passwords and kind of settle for something. Good passwords, when available, of course, also will contain numbers, letters, and symbols. This isn't as much of an issue as it has been in the past. Most websites will let you use a combination of numbers, letters, and symbols, but in cases where you have a very short numerical password, like for a PIN, you want to make sure that it's, again, you're avoiding the bad password habit, such as using like your birthday or your birth year for a PIN. And of course, good passwords should be unique to your account. You should absolutely not be sharing passwords with different accounts, just because, as said before, if an attacker gets into one account, then they have access to multiple accounts. What is two-factor authentication? Two-factor authentication is sometimes referred to as multi-factor authentication, but essentially it's when your password is secured with multiple devices. So, for instance, you will put your password into a website, and then it will ask you to follow up by putting in a code that you got from a text message or checking a message from a different email account that is wherever the code has been sent. The most basic version of this is two-factor authentication, but for more secure accounts, sometimes you will see multi-factor authentication where the website will ask for one device and then ask for another device, or maybe ask you security questions or something similar. So two-factor authentication helps secure your account by taking extra steps to confirm that it really is you trying to get into your account. It's possible that an attacker may get your password, but it's more unlikely that they will know your password and have access to your cell phone or an authenticator key or something similar. So there are some pros and cons to having multi-factor authentication. The first and foremost, obviously, is that it makes it very difficult for an attacker to remotely get into your accounts. They would have to have access to the device you're getting two-factor codes from, like your cell phone, which, again, while possible, is very unlikely. There are some cons to two-factor authentication, though, and again, they mostly come down to personal habits, such as if you set up two-factor on a device that you don't frequently bring with you, like a phone, that could be an issue. It could be an issue if you switch cell phones a lot. It can also be an issue if you are traveling. Of course, even with two-factor authentication, it is still very important to get into the habit of making good passwords, because ultimately that will still be your primary defense against attackers. A lot of times it depends on the website, but there are ways to get around two-factor authentication, and just having a good password is still a very good way of preventing unauthorized access to your accounts. So, compromised accounts. Your account is compromised when an attacker has successfully bypassed your password and any sort of two-factor authentication measures that you may have. This usually happens because of bad password making habits, but there are times when it is actually the site's fault, and maybe they've had a server breach or something. But compromised accounts are very bad because, again, at that point, your critical information is able to be viewed by someone else, and they can take that information and make your life very difficult with it. Generally, the very first thing you want to do when an account has been compromised is immediately go in and make sure that you change your password and maybe add some sort of two-factor authentication if you don't already have it. And then after that, depending on the importance of the site, like a banking site, for instance, you may have to follow up with that organization in order to determine what exactly is missing and what needs to be done on your end. So, what are the signs of a compromised account? Well, the main indicator would be suspicious activity. Now, this can be login activity, just general activity associated with the account, or things that you previously didn't do that are now happening. Login activity is typically recorded through email. A lot of times a website will send you an email if you're logging in from a new or previously unused IP address. Not always, but sometimes. If the website in question has some kind of store on it and you're noticing maybe unauthorized purchases from that website, well, that not only is that an issue with your account, but you may want to look into some banking information as well. Unusual notifications are a big one. Those tie in with the other two. If you're getting notifications about logins from IP addresses that you don't recognize, or just other weird things that are happening, that can be a big sign. And then finally, if an attacker is in your account and has actually changed your account information and you can't log in, even though you're very certain that you're putting in the correct password, that would definitely be a warning sign, and you would have to go through some additional steps in order to regain access to your account. So, password managers. At its core, a password manager is simply a piece of software that stores your password and account information for you. And typically when you go to a website in question, it will ask you if you would like to use the information that is stored for that website. The most common type of password manager is usually the one built into your browser that will ask if you want to save your password after you enter it for the first time on a website. That's pretty standard across all browsers, and it's the most convenient, but there are some security risks that go along with it because the password isn't always stored securely, and it's usually able to be seen plainly if you have access to the computer. Normally, there is an option to view it without having to put in any further information. So it's probably a good idea to use a password manager if you have many accounts and aren't always remembering the passwords for them. Of course, this is kind of a double-edged sword because if you're using a password manager, you're less likely to remember your password. So that kind of leads us into certain instances where you probably shouldn't use a password manager. If you're using these accounts across multiple devices and your password manager doesn't sync across those devices, then it's probably a bad idea, especially if you don't remember the password because it's in a password manager. If your device is being used by multiple people, such as like a family computer, then yeah, it's probably not a good idea to use a password manager just because, especially if it's a browser-based one, your passwords are visible without extra security measures. There are many different password managers out there, but the good password managers will have some kind of extra security factor to them, like asking you for your credentials before you can actually view your passwords. That's probably the main thing you should look for in a password manager. Encryption can also be nice, especially if an attacker potentially has access to your device locally. Two-factor authentication, similar to an account's password, can also be a good thing to have with password managers, just because you are storing very important information in them. Ideally, your password manager will be on a computer that only you are using, but just making sure that the password manager does have some kind of password protection on it, and again, potentially two-factor, would be a very good way to secure it. Of course, even if you are using a password manager, good passwords are still necessary because ultimately an attacker can access your account by cracking the password. So if you're storing a bad password in a good password manager, then it really doesn't matter because that password is still vulnerable to attacks. So password defense in depth. So defense in depth is the idea that your security measures should not be reliant on one strong single measure, but rather multiple spread out across, so that if an attacker gets through one security measure, they still have the other ones to deal with. This applies to passwords in the sense that your password is your strongest defense, but your overall security can be improved by combining your strong password with two-factor authentication and a good password manager. That way, if an attacker is able to breach one of these security tools, they have to get through additional tools in order to get access to your personal information. So, some key things to remember. Good password habits are critical. Good passwords should not be a one-time thing, and they should not be used across multiple accounts. Good password making is a mindset, and it is important to keep good password making habits strong and to not let yourself fall into the habit of making convenience and bad passwords. Second, you should use two-factor authentication whenever it is available to you. Two-factor authentication basically is your second line of defense besides a good password, and it can help make sure that even if your good password is breached, that an attacker will not be able to gain access to your account unless they have your device. Consider using a password manager. Password managers do have their own pros and cons, and they're not for everyone. But if you're a person that has multiple accounts and you find yourself hitting the forget my password button a lot, then yes, a password manager is probably a good idea. In the long run, it can help you keep your passwords more secure. And finally, remember that these security measures are not a substitute for a good, strong password. They may help keep your account secure, but ultimately, your good password is going to be your main line of defense between an attacker and your critical information.